Hello and welcome back. In this video I'm going to be making a desktop for a stand-up desk that I'm making for my home office. Start the process out by looking through some maple lumber here that I purchased, rough cut and dried for about 7 or 8 years according to the man I bought it from. And I'm just measuring to find a rough length here of where I want to cut these off. Now taking it over to the chop saw, I'm cutting those pieces to rough length on those chalk lines there. I wanted to make a 6-foot desk, so I have 7 feet of material here just so I have a foot or so to work with. Taking it over to the joiner here, flattening one face. This is about the maximum size of my joiner. It's about a 6 1/8 inch joiner, and these boards were topping just about that. When joining these large faces like this, I often flip the pieces over to check my progress and see how I am with flattening. And I repeated this process for all the boards. Now going over the thickness planer, I can reference the side that I flattened, put that face down, and then the top side cuts the other side parallel to that. These pieces needed quite a bit of work, so passing them through, there was quite a few passes through to get them to the final thickness. And I cheated quite a bit on this project. Knowing the bottom won't be seen, I planed as little as possible just to get the top surface flat, and then I was able to glue creatively and clamp to allow the bottom side to not be so flat. And in the end, it turned out just fine. Now after those are roughly flat, I take them over to the table saw to get those two edges flat so that I have a good surface to glue together. You can see the low spots still in these shots, showing how I'm going to put those face down as they won't be seen. Especially with a little bit of sanding, that's all it takes to hide those on the B side of the piece. Now here jumping to the glue up, you can see there's a few rough sides facing up, but the bulk of them are face down. And as long as those glue joints are together, those bad sides facing down won't be seen. And as it is a desk, the top is the only side that's seen most of the time unless you're working underneath with cable management or something like that. That silicone tray and brush from Rockler really make glue ups a lot easier. It allows you to get a good spread over the surface, and after it dries, you can just peel the dry glue right off. I use quite a bit of clamps in this glue up as well, just to force these pieces together to make sure I hit that flat surface, which will become the top. And I clamped it down to the desk, just to keep once again to keep that flatness. Now removing the clamps a day later, I was pretty happy with the surface that I got. There was no major gaps in my glue up, and all the work I had to do would be to fill those couple knots and imperfections in the top of the wood. You can see a knot there. That was the worst of them. There's a few other minor spots that I had to stabilize with epoxy here. I use West Systems epoxy, and I start by prepping the other side if there's holes that go all the way through by putting some blue painter's tape on. And that just allows that epoxy a surface to sit on and doesn't allow it to leak through the piece, and it will if you don't have a good joint. Then flipping the piece over, I go through all those areas that I deemed rough and put epoxy in and let that cure over a couple days. Now after it's dry, all those knots and cracks are stabilized to the point where they won't break over time. And I'm able to remove that tape, and you can see some of the spill out there. And then I start hitting with the belt sander. This just gets the bulk. There's a few high spots where the joints were connected, and it gets rid of those saw marks that I didn't totally plane out. And it gets it a flat enough surface where you'd never know. I start by going across the grain like this, and then as I work later on, I go with the grain, and then moving to the orbital sander the same way. Just getting a flat surface. Now I'm marking my edges to cut my sides here, as they're rough cut now. This track that's compatible with pretty much any circular saw allows you to get a nice cut with a little bit of setup ahead of time. So I just line that up, and it allows me to get a straight 90-degree cut on both sides. Now I'm prepping for the angle iron that I'm going to install on the bottom side of the table. Start by cutting it. This is just a piece of C-channel. It's like 1.5 inches by 1/4 inch high or so. And you'll see I'll recess it into the bottom of the table just to prevent the table from potato chipping over time. This is a new method that I've never tried before this, and I wanted to give it a try on this project, so I decided to. Now I'm laying out, and you can see what I'm trying to do here. I'm basically going to route a profile that allows those two sides of the C-channel to sit in of the bottom of the table. And then screwing that metal to it allows the wood not to be able to flex and cup over time if there's any moisture left in the wood. Which in this case there probably wasn't. This was just a new technique I wanted to experiment with. I start by drilling that hole that you saw in the previous shot, and then taking small passes with a router. I ultimately ended up using a larger router as this small trim router wasn't doing it, so I used my full size to finish those cuts. But this just allowed those recesses for a spot for that C-channel to sit in. And you can see how that cut progresses. It's a slow process, and the sawdust gets bound up in there. But taking small passes with that router, and then later big passes with my larger router, allowed it to be pretty easy. Now that C-channel drops right in there like that. And then it can be fastened to the table. You won't see it from underneath. And it gives the table some support. Now before I go any further with finishing, I apply my brand to the underside of the table, and then give it a light sanding before finishing. I went with polyacrylic on this project as I needed this relatively quickly, and I wanted to experiment with the durability over time with polyacrylic. Normally with a desktop or tabletop I'd use a polyurethane, but I wanted to try something different. And if this doesn't work, I can always sand it off and put on that harsher product, but this allows several coats to be done in a day, and so far so good. It's been holding up well. And now after the sanding and finishing, you could barely notice those couple low spots on the bottom where I didn't fully plane out the material. I'm jumping back to the C-channel, marking my center line, just a rough center line. And then I pull some dimensions for some screw locations that I'm going to put into the table. Just kind of did this by eye and just by some rough measurements. And then going through with a center punch to mark those centers where I can then drill through the C-channel. And you can see these aren't exact locations. This is just a close enough kind of thing, because after I put the finish on and round these off, will be virtually centered anyway. I make a larger countersink than the screws I'm using so that it does hide that center line a little better. Off camera, I painted these black, and then I'm ready to install them to the tabletop here. I pre-drill all the holes as I'm going into hard maple. And I come back in with some short Robertson screws and screw the angle right to the piece. And then this is the desk in its final home. And so far so good, I'm liking it very much. Thank you all for watching and your continued support. And please leave a comment of a video you'd like to see next. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.